maybe kind of the essence of charisma is, once again, it's telling someone, I am going to allow you to participate in history. If you follow me, you will be at the front of the stage when the world as we know it changes forever.
Joseph Laycock is the author of The Penguin Book of Cults, as well as several other works, many of which cover different aspects of the satanic panic. So, he's a kindred spirit. He's also the associate professor of religious studies at Texas State University, and he's here to talk with me today about the way our culture thinks of and reacts to what we oftentimes incorrectly identify as cults. Beyond the well-known heavy hitters of the 20th century, his book delves into many lesser-known examples of new religious movements from the 18th century into the early 20th century, groups made up of vampires, hollow earthers, and dangerous yogis, all of which we will be discussing today. In addition, Joe will help us better understand what a cult is and what a cult isn't, and how, in our modern context, this label only goes so far in helping us come to terms with the people who support authoritarian movements. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited to be talking today to you, Joe. Thank you for being here. This is going to be a conversation that I think is going to interest almost every single one of our listeners.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad. Okay, so we're talking today about cults, which is, of course, one of the best topics to talk about in the world, but also one of the most misunderstood. So I wanted to just introduce us to you and to your work by asking you how you got into this realm of study, whether it be cults or new religious movements, which is kind of the, I guess we could say PC term, but that's not really what I mean. But could you just tell us why you decided to write this tome that you have written and gotten into this line of work?
Sure. So I'm a professor of religious studies, and doing these kinds of topics, it's sort of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, most of these groups, no one has ever really studied them before.
Yeah.
These are by definition very kind of small, fringe, marginalized groups, and so you can be the first person to write a publication on these groups. The downside is people will say, well, I don't care about this, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you want to get a job in religious studies. Universities say, well, we need an expert on the Bible, and we need an expert on Islam, and we need someone who can talk about Buddhism. We don't really need a professor of Scientology or an expert on, Wicca or these other kinds of marginalized groups. So I'm in a field called new religious movements, and we study those groups that are sort of marginalized or stigmatized or have kind of been pushed to the edges of the American religious landscape. But these are the religions that my students really want to know about. These are the ones that they're sort of most excited to study when they come to take a religious studies class. So I am the faculty member that facilitates looking at these kinds of groups.
So I'd probably be coming into your office quite a bit to sit in that chair across from you and talk, I think. So, okay, so I like to sometimes start by defining terms. So let's talk about this word cult and its meaning, maybe its lack of meaning at this point. And if you could explain the qualities that make a cult or a new religious movement, we'll let you take it where you take it. And if you could also talk about how the word cult kind of transformed into something that's so much broader and less precise than maybe we'd like it to be.
Sure. So the word cult, it comes from the Latin cultus, which basically means to worship. It's related to our word cultivate, so take care of something. So the Roman Cicero talked about the cultus deorum, the care of the gods. So originally, cult just meant any sort of organized worship. And then around the 1920s, it came to mean what it means today, which is something that looks like religion, but it's not really religion, or it's a bad or evil religion. And so the kind of connotations that people have with cults today are mind control. These people didn't really want to be in this group. They don't really want to be in it now. There's some kind of nefarious practice that is taking away their free will. The leader is all powerful and sort of has maximum control over the group. They're isolated. There is sexual abuse occurring. There's financial abuse occurring. All these things are implied when somebody calls a group a cult. The thing is, you cannot have any of those characteristics and you can still be considered a cult. So, for example, here in Texas, I find people all the time who say, well, Wicca is a cult. If you've ever met any Wiccans, they really are not into having all-powerful leaders. They don't have any of the characteristics I just described. What they mean is it's a different religion and I don't like it.
Right.
And so this is the problem, is that it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. In fact, in Europe, there are European countries that have lists of sects. They use the word a sect in France and Belgium the same way that we use the word cult. And those lists will include groups like the Methodists, the Quakers, the Young Women's Christian Association. And it's simply that these groups have kind of a different history and a different kind of perception in those other countries. This is very much in the eye of the beholder. And then the word cult is expanded. So now you don't even have to be a religion anymore to be a cult. A political party can be a cult. Fandom can be a cult. And just last month, there was a YouGov poll, and they asked people, do you think the following things are cults? And lots of people were willing to say Taylor Swift fans are a cult, vegans are a cult, gun owners are a cult. And not surprisingly, there were big patterns in whether you identified as a Democrat or a Republican with what types of groups you would categorize as a cult. So this is a term that's negative, but it's not very useful if we're trying to do kind of sociological analysis because it's so imprecise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that we hear this every day now. It's a colloquialism for something that we're uncomfortable with in a lot of ways. And so let's talk about something that I know that a lot of cults have in common, like maybe capital C cults or new religious movements. Not exactly the things we've just talked about, but these groups that are focused on kind of one belief system. In your book, you talk a lot about millennialism, which I think is really interesting and I've read a lot about. And I was hoping you could talk about that and how that informs the way that a cult behaves and forms.
Yeah, so not all so-called cults are violent, but the ones that are violent, especially these kinds of spectacular episodes of violence like we see in Jonestown in 1978 or Waco, Texas in 1993, what these all have in common, one of the things they all have in common is millennialism. And millennialism is the belief in some sort of imminent coming collective salvation. We call it millennialism because there's a passage in the book of Revelation that describes Jesus returning and there being 1,000 years of peace on earth. So technically all Christian churches are millennialists, but some of them believe this is going to happen much, much sooner than others. But other religions are millennialist too, right? So Heaven's Gate, a group that your listeners have probably heard of, when they said the aliens are going to come and they're going to take us to the level above human, that's millennialism. That's a form of collective salvation for their group. And you can also have political forms of millennialism. So when Hitler said that the Third Reich will last 1,000 years, that's directly referencing this idea of sort of a new world described in the book of Revelation. So one factor that we've noticed is if you are fervently connected to this millennialist scenario, and something comes along that seems to thwart that scenario or makes it look like it's less likely that it's actually going to happen, that is one of the factors that can make violence more likely to occur.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I also think that it's worth noting that this is one of those places where I feel like I could get duped, right? Because it is this, like, if you have any idealism inside of yourself, I think that is a good indication that you can be drawn into movements that perhaps aren't going to treat you the best because, you have this dream of a better world. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it can be pretty easily exploited by people that can see that potential within you.
Absolutely. I mean, over and over again, we see the people who end up doing these terrible things or participating in these types of violent groups. It was always the appeal of you get to play a key role in changing history forever, right?
Yeah.
This is like this epic vista of human history, and you get to be on stage, right? You're not going to be on the sidelines. You're going to be right here front and center. And that kind of, like you said, it appeals to kind of our better nature. It doesn't appeal to the worst in us. It appeals to the best in us. We get to be on the good guys' side.
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't want that, right? So you write in your book that people a lot of the time, most of the time, let's say, associate this word cult with a certain period in our history that seemed to be chocked full of them. So can you expand on what you were talking about with that passage?
Sure. So my field of new religious movements, it really dates back to a period in American history that we now call the cult wars, where there were debates about, are cults basically taking over America, and are they using brainwashing to do it? But really, my field traces its origins to the year 1965, when several things came together. So first of all, you had the baby boomers, this generation that was out sort of interested in spiritual seeking. And then in 1965, you had the Hart-Celler Act, and that changed immigration laws. So prior to that, Asians basically couldn't come to America from most Asian countries, and there were these quotas on immigration. After that, we started getting more Asians on the West Coast, and they brought their religions with them. So one of the religions that was imported after 1965 was the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, better known as the Hare Krishnas to lots of people. And then the Unification Church from South Korea, which lots of people know as the Moonies. And then the third thing was the Cold War. And the Cold War had introduced this concept of brainwashing, which was originally supposed to be this kind of nefarious, almost mystical psychotechnology that had been developed by Chinese communists. And that was really introduced into mainstream consciousness through the movie The Manchurian Candidate. And it quickly shifted from being something that communists and spies do to being something that religions do. So by the end of the 1960s, we had this narrative of, I sent my son off to Berkeley to study engineering, and now he has shaved his head and is a vegetarian and living in an ashram. He must have been brainwashed. They must have brainwashed him, just like in that movie, The Manchurian Candidate. So I think a lot of people feel that the 1960s was the moment when our culture kind of went off the rails, and that's when cults became a big problem in the United States. But the reality, if you study the history of religions, is there's always been religious change. There's always been weird new forms of religious practice emerging. This is the one constant of religious history.
Absolutely. And something that I have always wanted to study more, and I haven't actually gotten to it, is this fact that in its earliest forms, Christianity was really regarded as a cult. Is that something that you could speak to at all?
Yeah. So, we kind of have this image of, Romans being thrown to lions and things like that from Hollywood movies. But it is true that when Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, this was seen as this very disturbing religion. I mean, they talked about cannibalism, right? They said, Our leader rose from the dead, and now we eat his flesh. So there were these rumors that started about the Christians. And so I've included some of these in the books. But one of the most persistent rumors was they have these orgies where they engage in incest, right? So everybody will show up and they'll have a candle. And then once the candle goes out, you just grab the person closest to you, whether it's your mom or your sister or whatever, and you just get it on with them. And then the other rumor is that to become a Christian, they give you this loaf of bread shaped kind of like a baby, and they give you basically a club, and they say, you got to beat this loaf of bread. No. And then you find out it's a real baby, and they say, okay, well, you just murdered a baby, so you're a Christian for life now. If you ever go against the Christians, we're going to tell everyone you're a baby murderer.
Oh my God.
And what I find so interesting about these rumors is these are the exact same rumors that Christians would later spread about Jews and about witches, and that we see right now with QAnon.
Yeah.
So we seem to be hardwired to tell these kinds of stories. The only thing that changes is which group of people we're telling them about.
You're blowing my mind with that. That is so much wilder than I expected the answer to be. And yeah, like you said, it's satanic panic shit, like through and through. It's the same stuff that we saw in Michelle Remembers, and that was popularized. And it's so wild. I mean, the stories, I guess that it's atrocity propaganda. It's very powerful.
I do think there is something in human psychology going on here. One of my teachers, when I was a graduate student, was named David Frankfurter, and he wrote a book called Evil Incarnate about satanic panic. But his conclusion is, as human beings, we keep making up this story about an evil conspiracy over and over and over again, because this is a way of sort of assuring ourselves that we are the good guys and that the way that we are doing things is the only way that society could ever be organized. And that's why the bad guys, whether it's witches or Satanists or Illuminati, deep state or whatever, they always have our values, but upside down, right? So we take care of babies, they eat them, right? We have so-called normal consensual sexual relationships. They are having sex with their family members or with children. It's this sort of upside down version of our own ideas of right and wrong.
Yeah, I saw that a lot when I was recently doing research and, creating an episode around Bloody Mary. And we were looking into how the idea of the mirror witch is this inversion of everything that we value. More after this. And now back to the show. So, okay, I'm going to venture a guess that most of our listeners are at least generally familiar with the big dogs in the post-war cult world, like the Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, Hare Krishnas, Manson family, People's Temple. But what was so exciting about your book is you brought us some much earlier cults from the late 17th century through the early 19th century. And I want to get into some of those. Like, can we teach our audience about some of these cults?
Sure.
Wait, I would love, I think, Joe, if we could start with the vampires, which is a sentence I always like to be able to say.
Sure. So the Penguin Book of Cults, it's Penguin Classics. It's not Penguin, last week. So a lot of the documents that you can read in this book are documents that are old and kind of forgotten. And one of them is this headline from 1890 that says a vampire cult in Kansas City. And this is a newspaper article from 1890, and it was all over the country. As far away as Honolulu, people were publishing this story, but it was describing a religious cult that drinks human blood. They call themselves the Samaritans, and that they had sort of taken Christian ideas of love your neighbor and twisted them into, let other people drink your blood so that they can sort of get their health back. And it describes this cult leader who is drinking the blood of children whose parents are members of the cult, in order to kind of restore his vigor. A few people know about this story. We've never been able to find anything to corroborate it. So this may be kind of yellow journalism, which would have been common in this period in history. But even if it's not a true story, it's still significant because this story sold. People wanted to hear about this idea of vampires, of blood drinkers, but also the idea that it's a cult of vampires. It's this sort of scary, twisted version of Christianity. And as we were just saying, they're coming for the children. They're coming to get our kids and drink their blood.
Would you guess that there was a reason that an article like this would appear, like any kind of propaganda reason in the context of the time?
Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't seem to blame this on one particular group of people. Okay. So it's not like the immigrants are vampires or something like that. It's set in Kansas City, which, Kansas City would have been a big place for the beef trade. So there would have been,
Mm.
slaughterhouses and things like that. So that's kind of plausible. It's also interesting because this is before the novel Dracula came out.
Right.
But by 1890, Americans, they knew what a vampire was, and they were ready to hear stories about vampiric rituals going on in our midst.
So this would have been after the vampire panic of the East Coast, where they were digging up people that they thought were still alive, right? You know these stories?
Yeah, so it would have been well after that. But it is interesting because in this story, you have this founder of this cult. His name is Silas Wilcox, and he has tuberculosis, and that's why he's drinking all this blood from children. And of course, tuberculosis was what was killing the family off in the Mercy Brown case in Rhode Island, right?
Mm-hmm.
So before germ theory was introduced, vampirism had a kind of logic to it because one family member gets sick and then they die, and then the next family member gets sick. And in kind of vampire lore, this is the vampire sort of coming from the grave to feed off of the rest of the family. But this does kind of suggest that tuberculosis is still kind of this spooky disease, right? Just because you get sick and it's often incurable, but because it has this association with vampirism still.
And I mean, it's also interesting because from what I know of the late 1800s, we're also kind of getting into some very alternative forms of medicine. And that's kind of what this sounds like, too.
Yeah, this does actually, now that you mention it, and there have been cases where, human blood was prescribed as a form of medicine. So it's kind of not that wild of an idea that a group like this could exist, right?
And I guess the draining of blood had been around for centuries at this point, too.
Right. And of course, there's lots of, biblical passages about, you can't eat blood because the blood is the life and things like this. So that connection between vampirism and religion is kind of right there in the Bible already.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I had never thought of that, the 1,000-Year Reich, as being so directly biblical, too. It's so interesting. Okay, so what do you think would be a good next cult to talk about in this era? What are you drawn to speak to next?
We should do Cyrus Teed, I think, who said that we're living inside a hollow earth. I think.
Oh, yeah. Take it away, Joe.
Yeah. So Cyrus Teed, he lived from 1839 to 1908, and he had this vision where he said he was working in his electroalchemical laboratory. So he was kind of a quack physician. He had this degree in what would basically be alternative medicine today. And he says, I was working in my laboratory and I had this vision, and this goddess appeared to me and said that, I am the Messiah and that she is my wife, but also my mother.
Hey.
and I have this big quest. And so it's this, he kind of creates this religion that is combining elements of apocalyptic Christianity with Eastern mysticism and ancient Egypt and sort of bizarre fringe science. And he starts this group in Florida. He starts a commune. And for a while, the commune gets pretty big. And he calls this Koreshianity. He calls himself Koresh, which in the Bible, the Israelites are taken away to Babylon. And Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. And not really to help out the Israelites, but just to conquer Babylon.
Sure.
And then he says, well, who are these people? They're from Israel, whatever. Get out of here. Go home. But to the Israelites, Cyrus was sent by God, right? Cyrus was this great liberator. And so their name for Cyrus was Koresh. So he forms this group in Florida. And then one of his claims is that the earth is hollow. So there are lots of people who have theories of a hollow earth. We saw this in movies like King Kong versus Godzilla, right? But Cyrus says, no. It's like we're living inside the hollow earth already, right? So we're living on the inside of this hollow earth. It's like an egg. And then if you dig into the ground, you're actually digging up. You're actually digging away from the center of the earth.
Wait,
and it's just
what?
nothingness, right?
Hold on. I'm having trouble visualizing this. So we are inside the Earth, but it's like reversed?
That's right. So the Earth is,
Okay.
according to Cyrus T, the Earth is this kind of hollow sphere. The sun is in the center of the sphere. Right. So when
Okay.
you look at the sun, you're looking towards the center of the sphere. And if you could see past the sun, you would see the opposite side of the Earth. That's
Wow.
cosmology according to Cyrus Teed.
All right. An original flat earther, but even weirder.
That's right. And Cyrus Teague would say, look, the sort of conventional understanding of the solar system is totally wrong scientifically, but also it's theologically wrong because God would never put us in this kind of vast, infinite nothingness.
Sure.
God loves us. God would want to keep us safe. Right? So we're very secure inside this earth. And he had his followers perform this experiment that involved putting stakes along the beach in Florida and measuring them. And they did this for weeks. And they were taking measurements. And he said, these measurements prove my theory is correct, that the ground does actually curve upward the further you go because we're living inside this hollow sphere.
Interesting. Wow.
And so eventually the movement, after he died, the movement kind of collapsed. There was a brief period where they waited to see if he would resurrect, and he did not. The sort of last vestige of it that exists today is this basically charitable foundation in Florida. Yeah, and they maintain some parklands and stuff like this. I don't think anyone is keeping his ideas alive. But what's really interesting is there was, of course, another famous cult leader who called himself Koresh,
Right.
and that was David Koresh. And so there was always speculation, did David Koresh find Cyrus Teed's writings and basically plagiarize this cult? And some people have compared the writings of these two people and found lots and lots of similarities. And so during the Branch Davidian siege, this was this 51-day siege when the FBI was trying to get David Koresh to surrender and come out and be arrested. There were religion scholars who tried to help. Unfortunately, the FBI didn't really listen to them. But one thing that they said was, did you know that there is a copy of Cyrus Teed's book about Koreshianity in the Waco Public Library? And somebody checked it out. And you should send this book into the compound and let the Branch Davidians read it, because if they read it, they might think that their leader just ripped off somebody else's religion, and maybe they'll lose faith in him and maybe they'll come out. And unfortunately, we'll never know what would have happened if the FBI had tried that.
Sure. Instead of what would eventually happen. Yeah.
I do wish the FBI had been more patient and listened more to religion scholars, because I really do believe the Waco siege could have been avoided. Or at least the fire could have been avoided that ended the Waco siege.
If only you would have been there, Joe. I would have liked to see what happened.
Well, there really were, Bible scholars who said, I can debate the Bible with this guy. I know what this guy is talking about. I know these prophecies. But unfortunately, they listened to these anti-cult scholars who said, you can't negotiate with this guy.
Right.
And if he starts talking about the Bible, ignore it. It's just Bible babble.
Yeah.
And obviously, lots of people would say, well, the things that David Koresh is saying about the Bible are not true, and we disagree with them. But there is still an internal logic to them, which can be understood. So a lot of what people in the field of new religious movements do is we try to offer our services as what we call worldview translators, right? So if you think somebody is this crazy apocalyptic cultist, well, that's fine, but you can find someone who speaks crazy apocalyptic cultist, and maybe we can get them to cooperate with authorities.
You can give it a try, at least. Yeah. This is reminding me of one of the most ridiculous stories of my life, and that is when our team went down the Westboro Baptist Church rabbit hole, and I took it really very, very, very seriously, and I was really dedicated to exactly that, because all of the ways we talk about the Westboro Baptist Church, in many ways rightly, just glaze over any attempt to understand the principles that they've created and why. And I really I went in there and I really understood it, which was wild. I didn't agree with it in any way, but it was such a profound experience. And eventually they did hear it, the Westboro Baptist Church, and they tweeted at me and they called me a sodomite and made fun of me. And I just responded like, hey, I really tried to understand your point of view. How do you think I did? And they just sent me like pretty good with a thumbs up. And I've always been like, I'll take it. So.
Well, I'm jealous. I've never been personally condemned by the Westboro Baptist Church, right?
It's a rite of passage.
But to your point, there are people who leave the Westboro Baptist Church, and it's a very difficult process for them to leave because they've been born into it and they've been told, according to Calvinism, if you leave, that means that God always was going to send you to hell, right?
Exactly.
You were predestined to go to hell. But if you don't understand this tradition, then you can never persuade those people to leave.
Yeah.
Right. So it's important to look past just the disgust and kind of how nasty they are and actually try to figure out, why are they like this? Right?
Yeah.
Why would they spend their time doing this all day? And that's possible, but it requires some field work that's pretty difficult for most people to do. There's a really great book about the Westboro Baptist Church called God Hates by Rebecca Barrett Fox.
Yeah, I read that for the episode. It was very, very helpful.
Yeah. And of course, Rebecca Barrett Fox couldn't be further apart from the Westboro Baptist Church on just about everything.
Yeah.
But she was able to kind of do that work of worldview translation. And I really respect her for being able to do that.
Yeah, as do I. It was a fantastic book. More after this. And now back to the show. Okay, so going back to Cyrus Koresh, Koreshianity, what were the years that the cult was really picking up steam?
So they end up in Florida in basically the late 1800s.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what was the reaction like? Was this group like familiar to the population, and how were they received by people?
So people in Florida definitely knew about them. And I found at least one incident where, there was basically a kind of bar fight type altercation, and some of the locals assaulted Cyrus Teed because they were kind of sick of his crap. And there was also a fear of block voting, right? That Cyrus Teague could run for office and he has enough followers to bring in and kind of swing an election in his favor. But a lot of the reportage that I found about him in newspapers was kind of just, isn't this weird and interesting?
Interesting,
right?
Yeah.
And actually kind of not as negative as you might expect, and not really taking any of it seriously. But saying kind of, isn't this weird? And isn't it kind of impressive that this guy was able to set up a whole community with their own kind of, farms and facilities and workshops and all this kind of stuff. And it's actually kind of impressive.
Do you think that we were easier on new religious movements, or whatever you'd like to call them, at that time?
I think we were a little bit easier on them. I mean, there was definitely still anxiety about groups like this, right? That's not new. But in the 1970s, if we compare to the 1970s, there were these articles saying cultism is taking over the world in the form of a pandemic.
Yeah. Wow.
And there really was this belief that these people have mind control powers. And if you even talk to them for too long, they can control your mind and they can force you to become a cultist for the rest of your life. And we don't really have that in the 1890s. So if you went around America in the 1890s and you said, I'm the second coming of Christ, I'm the Messiah, right? People would get annoyed for sure. And they might even get violent. We find cases like that.
Sure.
But things have not been medicalized that they were in the 1960s and 70s. And so I think it was maybe not quite as scary and was more likely to be viewed with kind of as a curiosity or a human interest story rather than some big threat that's coming for America.
Right. And I would imagine that is in part because, this dude was a white guy. He was operating within a Christian framework, whereas in the 60s and later in the 70s, I think that, people of a different generation were seeing these, radical hippies and really just being baffled by a worldview that was so completely divorced from anything that they even remotely understood. So it does make sense that we would want so desperately to have something to blame for, our wayward teenagers who are heading out west to follow these, strange people.
That's right. And some of the first groups that were really kind of talked about as cults, the way that we talk about them today, were in California. And what was disturbing was not, claims to be the Messiah or people living in communes. What was disturbing was that they had members who were Asian.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That there was maybe, one or two Japanese people in the movement. So the kind of fear of the religious other, it always kind of intersects with other kinds of fears about different groups of people.
And that brings me to another kind of cult situation that I wanted to talk about. And that was what I believe you referred to as the invasion of the yoga cults.
Yes, we have this great article from 1911 about yoga cults. And it's written by this female journalist named Mabel Potter Daggett, who was a suffragette and actually, had a lot of positive qualities. But the article itself is profoundly racist, right? She's talking about the swarthy priests of the East and things like this. And
it's a good band name. Yeah,
that's right. And, it says these golden-haired American women are bowing at the feet of these, dark-skinned people from India. But the first line of this article begins, "Eve is eating the apple again. It is offered as a knowledge of the occult that shall solve the riddles of existence. Yoga, that Eastern philosophy, the emblem of which is the coiled serpent, is being widely disseminated here, and before a charm that seemingly they cannot resist, thousands of converts are yielding to the temptation to embrace its teachings of strange mysteries." And she goes on and says, what more could tempt the feminine mind? Right? But the promise of, Asian mysteries and being beautiful forever. And so the claim in this article is, they sort of sucker in these women with these yoga classes, and they tell them it'll make them beautiful, it'll make them wise. And then yoga is basically just mind control. And then once you are mind controlled, they ship you back to India and basically turn you into a temple prostitute. And there's this whole kind of backstory here about so-called nautch girls. And these were originally women who would have been dancers in Hindu temples and would have been highly respected. And then under the strains of British colonialism, some of them did begin doing sex work. But then there was this kind of fantasy of about white slavery, right? And
right,
first step is yoga class, and the last step is you're now this sacred prostitute somewhere in India. But people were really panicked when yoga was first introduced to the United States. And there's a long story about how they basically had to reframe yoga as not being something religious, but being what at the time was called physical culture, right? They said this isn't a religious thing. It's just to help you, build up your muscles and build up your vigor. And now in America, we have kind of the opposite, where Hindus are saying, yoga was supposed to be spiritual. And instead, you're talking about, getting a yoga butt.
Right.
So it's a long kind of saga, but it begins with this real fear of this strange religion practicing a mind control and coming for our women.
Were there any particular leaders in this movement that attracted attention from the population?
Sure. So in 1892, they had the World's Fair in Chicago, and part of the World's Fair in actually 1893 was the World Parliament of Religions. And they said, we're going to have religious leaders from all over the country, or all over the planet actually, come together in Chicago and talk about their views. And I think the people organizing thought, well, this is going to be great because everybody will see that Christianity is better than Hinduism and Buddhism and all these other religions. What they did not expect was that some of the speakers coming from India were really well-spoken and gave really amazing speeches and got everybody really interested. And so one of these people was Swami Vivekananda, who came and spoke about Hinduism, and people really liked it. And he did this tour of the country afterwards and actually taught the first yoga classes ever taught in America. And initially, Americans were kind of too freaked out to even do yoga in the 1890s. So the first yoga class was, he said, okay, well, we're just going to sit here in our chairs. and we're going to do some breathing exercises, because the idea of like getting on the floor and, assuming postures and stuff, that was just a bridge too far for Americans in the 1890s.
Yes.
And then he founds a group called the Vedanta Society, which still exists today. And there are still Vedanta Society establishments in cities like Boston, and you can go and you can hear lectures about the Vedas and other Hindu texts and Hindu philosophy and so forth. But the Vedanta Society continued to be a source of fear for many Americans for a long time. So there was this famous court case where this widow died and left her fortune to the Vedanta Society. And the family said they mind controlled her, right? These priests used their hypnosis powers on her mother, and that's why she left them all of this money. It's hard to imagine that kind of argument getting much traction if she had left it to a Christian church,
right?
As opposed to a Hindu organization.
Right. Yep. I was just thinking about like, there could be no shallower breathing than that of Christianity. So it probably really frighten them to feel a deep breath. So is there any other cult that you think we should talk about before we kind of move more into the present day? I know there's the failed Messiah of Winnebago County. That was one I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, George Schweinfurth.
Nice name.
This guy who, it's really interesting just watching this person's rise and fall, but his dates are 1853 to 1910. And for a while, he establishes this farm where people believe that he is Jesus, and he is practicing basically this form of polygamy where he's surrounded by kind of this harem of beautiful women who say that they are, brides of Christ. And all these babies keep being born that everyone says are being born by the Holy Spirit, right? They're being they're being immaculately conceived, but they all kind of look like George Schweinfurth. And people are noting this. And people become increasingly outraged. And at one point, this vigilante group called the White Caps, who are basically the Ku Klux Klan, say they're going to go and tar and feather him. So he kind of reaches his peak, and then everything kind of falls apart, and he ends up basically living in Pittsburgh, and nobody knows kind of who he is, and he's selling selling like mining stocks. So he goes from being this really famous figure that all the newspapers are talking about to just kind of saying, never mind, I'm not Jesus, I'm not the Messiah. I just want a normal life. So it's this very strange kind of a flash in the pan type of story. I wonder kind of, was this always just sort of a con and you got tired of the con?
Yeah.
If you're surrounded by people who act like you're Jesus, do you truly come to believe that you're Jesus? I mean, it's hard to tell with these types of figures.
But then you're just kind of like, well, I'm over this. I'm going to go like join a pyramid scheme or something like that is what that kind of sounds like to me.
Right. I mean, that's what's kind of unusual, is that he did seem to have this willingness to just let all this go. Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we talk a lot about in the study of cults and new religious movements is charismatic authority.
Yeah.
So there's two types of authority in sociology. So legal authority is just, you're like, I was voted the head of the homeowners association, so I get to, have the following powers, and it's supported by the law. But charismatic authority comes directly from your personality. People believe that there is something special about you. Charismatic authority is actually very fragile, because once people see that you're just a normal person like everybody else, then you've lost it. And so I think in cases like Jonestown and the Branch Davidians, you had a charismatic leader who was willing to do basically anything to keep that charismatic authority, right? They would not lose the followers no matter what. So it's interesting that we have someone like Schweinfurth who says, okay, well, I guess if I don't have any followers, it's fine. I can just go and sell mining stocks somewhere. I can do other things. And I actually think that's probably more common, right? I think that these, we call them the Big Five, these incidents of really spectacular violence like Jonestown and Waco. Those are the exception. Most new religious movements are more like Schweinfurth, where they maybe get a little traction for a while and they kind of quietly die out. That's way more typical.
And that's totally not the idea that I have in my head. So that's, again, this idea that we have the cinematic version of new religious movements.
Yeah, and this is called the heuristic fallacy, right? So if I ask someone to name a cult, they're going to name the cult that they've, heard the most about in the media, right? But that leads to the perception that all cults are like Jonestown or the Branch Davidians, and actually those are quite rare. And I've shown my students an episode of Family Guy about a cult where the leader says, well, I have to form this cult so that we can all commit mass suicide together, right? I can't commit suicide alone. That would look like a weirdo.
Right.
And so because of the heuristic fallacy, we've kind of come to this idea of, the purpose of cults is to commit mass suicide or to commit some spectacular act of violence. It's actually very few groups that have ever done that. And when they do it, it's I'm not justifying it, but they don't set out to do that. They kind of arrive at that decision through kind of a long series of unfortunate events.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think if we can now move into the present day, since we've been hanging out, at the turn of the century and earlier, and we've talked a little bit about the 60s. So you, I know, have written quite a bit about QAnon and kind of analyzing that, let's say movement through the lens of your work. So could we talk a little bit about how QAnon fits into the framework of the things that you write about?
Sure. So lots of people have said, QAnon is a cult, right?
Right.
And I think that
I probably have, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, QAnon is a very, very strange and frankly dangerous a movement. So I understand why people have that kind of alarm. And there was a book called The Cult of Trump by Stephen Hassan, who has worked as a cult deprogrammer. And he's basically said, in the 1970s, I was brainwashed by the Moonies, and I helped deprogram people that were being brainwashed by these cults. And with Trump, it's exactly the same thing.
Right.
I'm not sure it is exactly the same thing. I know why you would want to believe that, right? If you have some racist uncle who ruins Thanksgiving talking about, Hillary Clinton drinks children's blood to get the adrenochrome, of course you'd want to believe my uncle isn't really like this, right?
Yeah.
Somebody is controlling him and making him like this. But our model of brainwashing, and you've talked about this on your podcast, it goes back to the Korean War, where you had prisoners of war, right, who were literally being told, write an essay about why capitalism is evil, or I will shoot you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's very, very different from it's just too much internet, right? The people involved in QAnon, no one's holding them prisoner. They can stop looking at QAnon at any moment, but they choose not to. So our framework of mind control is maybe not as helpful for that. Where I think it has something to do with cults is, again, this idea of millennialism, right? And specifically, there is a subtype of millennialism called nativist millennialism. So when new religions form, one of the scenarios in which many new religions form is if you have a group of people and they are colonized and their way of life is removed overnight. So in the United States in the 1890s, we had the so-called ghost dance religion.
Yeah, we actually talked about that in our last episode.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Okay. So the ghost dance religion is an example of nativist millennialism, right? The collective salvation is the world will be restored to the way that it was before. In the Pacific Islands, so-called cargo cults also often have this idea of nativist millennialism. They're a response to the rapid appearance and colonization by Westerners. So when I say that QAnon resembles nativist millennialism, it's not that the members of QAnon have been colonized or experiencing anything remotely resembling, say, Native American genocide.
Yeah.
But they feel they've been colonized, right? And I've talked to family members who say, I went to the doctor today and I had to list my pronouns.
Sure.
What is that about? What are my pronouns, right? And so they feel like some kind of other force has come in and done something to their country, has subverted it. They feel like there's this conspiracy. And so the millennialist scenario for QAnon is the so-called storm, right? This is how QAnon began. QAnon really began when Donald Trump was elected and he just wanted to stand in front of his generals and look cool. And he said, this might be the calm before the storm. I don't think he meant anything by it. I think he just wanted to sound cool. And then the reporters say, I'm sorry, sir, what storm? What are you talking about? Are we going to war? What do you mean? He just says, oh, you'll see. You'll see. And again, I don't think he meant anything by it. I think he just, he wanted to look, he wanted to look like a cool scene he saw in a movie or something like that. But immediately that begins this online discussion about the so-called storm. And that sets the stage for this person calling himself Q to insert himself and say, I'll tell you what the storm is because I have Q level clearance. And just not for nothing, Q is a character from James Bond movies. Right. This is so patently stupid. But anyways, the storm evolves into this whole scenario where they say, well, Donald Trump is working with the military and he's going to get the deep state and he's going to expose Hillary Clinton for her satanic worship and abuse of children. And everyone will see that we were right the whole time. Yeah. And the country will be totally remade into exactly how it was supposed to be. So they really become very, very invested in this. And then another area of study within new religious movements is what happens when you make a prophecy and it fails. Right. Yeah. What happens when people are told something will happen, it doesn't come true? Well, Catherine Wessinger, who's an expert on the Waco siege, has said, violence isn't guaranteed, but it becomes much more likely. Sure. Right. If everybody is prepared for this collective salvation and then they begin to fear it's not really going to happen. And so within that framework, it's not surprising that we saw tremendous violence on January 6th. Yeah. That was sort of our millennial prophecy is failing. And so we are resorting to violence. So I don't think it's particularly helpful to say QAnon is a cult, only because cult is such a vague word that means different things to different people. Yeah. But I do think that comparing it to what I call nativist millennialist movements is helpful and actually gives us a better way of maybe understanding it and possibly making some predictions about what groups like this might do next. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that point. So I think that, when we're talking about Trumpism as a cult, it seems to be more cut and dry. Not to say that that's my opinion, but in terms of what we think of as a cult with this charismatic leader that seems to be, quote unquote, controlling the population that supports him, right? And I'm interested too, since you've kind of talked about the way that you think of QAnon within your framework, could you also talk about Trumpism, MAGA? Yeah, I think when people say Trump is a cult, what they mainly are sort of pointing to is this apparent attitude that what Trump does is always correct, no matter what. So we literally saw this flip from the Democrats are all pedophiles, and we're going to get them, and we're going to get the pedophiles, we're going to release the Epstein files, we're going to find out what the Clintons are up to. And now we've had people like Megyn Kelly say, well, it's not really pedophilia. Yeah. Right. It's not like these are small children. These girls are barely legal. Well, they're not barely legal unless they're barely illegal. That's the problem with everything that happened with sex trafficking, with Epstein and all of that. But the flip is profound, right? How did you go from this is the most important thing in our country to it's not a big deal? And they do this all the time. We just saw this with the Second Amendment, right? Well, he brought a gun to a protest, so of course they shot him. I think people are right to point at that and say something very strange is going on here, and they call it a cult. I think, as you pointed out, the key to this is Trump's charisma. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk a little bit about our understanding sociologically of this concept of charisma. So if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, in Dungeons and Dragons, your character has a charisma score. Okay. And if you have a high charisma, you're just very good at influencing people. This is not how sociologists think charisma works, right? Mm-hmm. If Trump had a very high charisma score, we would all like him. In fact, about a third of the country thinks he's amazing and can do no wrong. And at least half the country thinks this is one of the worst people you've ever seen, right? Yeah. So charisma, it's not intrinsic to the leader. It is a way of talking about a special relationship between the leader and their followers. Right. That is from where charisma arises. And, sociologists, they like to say, well, we're being scientific, we're studying religion scientifically. Charisma can't be studied scientifically. It's not objectively real. It is simply a useful way of talking about things. But one thing that has been observed in charismatic relationships is if this is taken to enough of an extreme, a follower can basically attach their entire ego, their entire sense of self to the leader. And I think that is what has happened for some people with Donald Trump, right? So if you say Donald Trump is a pedophile, that is like telling them that they're a pedophile.
Sure,
and they will respond in the same kind of way. So when people say that Trumpism is a cult, to me, that's what I think they're getting at, right? That this is a level of attachment to a political leader that goes way beyond, they share my values or they share my political agenda. And it really goes to kind of, how do you even understand yourself as an individual? That's very unusual. And I think that's what's made the Trump era so confusing and so scary.
Yeah. And something that I have come across a lot is, in fascist movements, as well as, again, I feel like using this word is a little tired, but cults, the attractiveness of its leader often has to do with the confidence that leader has in their worldview. It's almost like, I know what the truth is. I know what we need to do. All you need to do is come along for the ride. And I can see why that's an attractive quality and something that you might want to just hitch your wagon to.
That's right. And we've talked about millennialism, but charismatic leaders and millennialism go hand in hand, because usually some millennialist scenario has a messiah. It has some chosen figure who's come along to do this. And, maybe kind of the essence of charisma is, once again, it's telling someone, I am going to allow you to participate in history.
Yes.
If you follow me, you will be at the front of the stage when the world as we know it changes forever. And I think that's really at the core of these fascist movements. It's that appeal of, I get to be the one bringing about this millennialist scenario.
Definitely. And even the slogan itself, Make America Great Again, pointing towards some idyllic future that only Trump can deliver on.
That's right. And when I say it's a nativist millennialist movement, right, it's right, like you said, it's right there in the slogan, right? America was great before, in their kind of imagined history. We just have to get it back to how it was. What scares me is, when do they think it was great?
Right. I know. No kidding.
For a lot of them, it was great before the Civil War.
Sure. Yeah. So something I have been thinking about a lot lately is, the people in my life who kind of took that unexpected turn toward Trumpism. And, I've just been trying to get into that mindset, because these are people that it was completely baffling to me, unexpected, so much so that it just doesn't make sense. And it makes me want to say, okay, this is propaganda. This is what propaganda does. And I do have this default position a lot of the time of I can see the good in people. I want to believe that you didn't make this decision. And I think that it's important to accept that people did make that decision. And that's really frightening in a lot of ways. And it's really hard to almost tackle. It's I think with cults and these movements, we're okay, you aren't in control. And maybe we can fight against an ideology, or we can fight against your leader. And then that will be the end of this issue. And you can come back to me and come back to this person that I understood.
Yeah, it's this is the paradox. It's actually less scary to believe that this is all just mind control.
Yeah, I know.
Right? I would so like to believe it's, oh, well, you went on that one YouTube channel that has the mind control powers, and I just got to get you off that.
Yeah, right.
Then you'll be back to normal. And people ask me, what do we do? And one thing where I think the study of cults is helpful is people don't stay in cults because they're mind controlled. People stay in cults because they have free will, but they don't have any good choices available to them.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are lots of people who say, I would really like to leave this group, but I don't have any friends or family who aren't in the group.
Yeah.
The group may have a policy of disfellowshipping, where if you leave, no one's allowed to talk to you ever. You can't really go and try to get hired for a job and your resume just says I was a cultist for 20 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not that they don't have free will. They just don't have any good choices to spend their free will on. And this is important because this is an area where we can help. So I think that we need to start saying, I really disagree with you on this MAGA stuff, on this QAnon stuff. But look, if you ever want to come back to dinner and talk about something other than MAGA, let me know. Like, we're here for you. You don't have to, be doing this 24/7. And some people, they're too far gone. They're never going to do that. But maybe a few of them will say, wow, I really did need to just kind of detox. That was too much internet. And I kind of got carried away.
Yeah. And it's not about like letting people off the hook. It's not about, excusing behavior. And it's not about being like soft on people. Because, I've been thinking, again, I try to just get in different mindsets when I can. And, the right thinks of the left as a cult just as much as I would say the left thinks of the right as a cult. We have the cult of transgenderism. We hear about that. And okay, so I've been a leftist my whole life. Almost all of the people in my life share at least, most of my values. And I'm like, what if I took that turn? What if I decided one day, you know what? I'm right wing now. I have completely changed my values. And, I wouldn't have anyone left. I wouldn't have friends, my family. I'm sure people would be willing to entertain me for a while. But I can see why, as you mentioned, it really is where do you go if your whole life has been built around this culture and this belief system? I mean, it's really, that's when I start to be like, okay, there's something here that we need to be thinking about and paying attention to beyond this idea that people don't have control over their beliefs. They do. They have control. They chose this. But if they ever want to unchoose it, then what are they going to do?
That's right. And you mentioned letting people off the hook. And again, brainwashing is letting people off the hook, right? The lawyers who represented the people who were arrested after January 6th, they called it the dumbass defense.
Yeah.
But they basically said, my client was brainwashed. They watched too much internet. And my client isn't very smart. Look at him wearing this dumb helmet with horns in the Capitol. It's not his fault. He's just this kind of sweet simpleton. So part of the appeal of brainwashing is that it does let people off the hook, right? If you've been involved in a group that's done very bad things, or at least things that are perceived as bad, you can plea that your choices weren't really your own, that you were the victim of brainwashing. So I think to really hold people accountable means coming up with a different explanation for their behavior than it was just mind control.
Yeah, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up because, it's hard having a podcast sometimes because I'm not trying to tell people ever how they should behave. But I think that, the ways that I am thinking about things is having that crack in the door for people who are trying to figure out how to have a life after they leave a, again, cult movement, authoritarian movement, just having that door just cracked a little bit. You can not do this. You can say that door is closed and I will say more power to you. But for me, I think that we need all the people that we can get, even if those people have profoundly sinned in our eyes. So I hope people understand what I'm saying because, it does feel like lines are drawn in a lot of ways. But if they're not drawn, then it's nice to imagine giving people that are changing some place to land, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Joe. This was such an interesting conversation. I always love talking about this stuff, and I really enjoyed your book. So thanks for all the work you do, and I think we should definitely have you back again sometime.
Well, I love your podcast, so anytime you'd like to have me, I'd love to return.
Thanks, Joe. This was American Hysteria. Make sure you pick up a copy of the Penguin Book of Cults. You can find a link in the episode notes. If you want to support our show, make sure we can continue making it, and get ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. Most recently, I did an episode with Sarah Marshall of You're Wrong About as a follow-up to our recent Jesus Toast episode, in which I tell her about 3 instances of Satan appearing in random places. We also have a big back catalog of Hysteria Home Companion, a podcast that I do with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we cover and stories we know that you'll love. And that's not all, so go check it out at patreon.com/American Hysteria or by subscribing on Apple Plus. If you go to our website at AmericanHysteria.com, you can leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or one you've even heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. You can also pick up some of our merch. 100% of the profits go to the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group who are on the ground in Gaza delivering food and supplies to displaced people. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith. This episode has additional editing by Kaylee Jasperson, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening. I hope you have a great week, and fuck ICE.